Matthias Schmelzer, economic historian and social theorist, thank you very much for sitting down with me today to talk about degrowth.
Sure. Thanks for inviting.
So let's start with the obvious question. What is degrowth?
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Having written on this term a lot and thinking about it, it's a great pleasure to share the degrowth ideas with new publics. So basically, degrowth is a term that emerged in the 2000s in activist and scholarly circles, mainly in Europe, and has since spread rather globally. And it's, on the one hand, it's a critique of the hegemony of economic growth in our societies. And on the other hand, it's also a proposal for a radical reorganization of these societies that basically leads to a drastic reduction in the use of energy use and resource use, while at the same time improving lives, leading to a rising standard of living. And this transformation is deemed fundamentally necessary, but also desirable and possible. And there's a whole debate around how this can actually be done. So maybe just like as one key starting point that really motivates this debate is the rising number of studies that basically show that further economic growth in the rich countries of the global north cannot be made sustainable. So even if this growth is green or inclusive, or if it's based on decarbonization strategies, etc., this will not lead to fast enough absolute decoupling rates of emissions and resource use. That's why we need to look to fundamental alternatives.
Great. So it sounds to me that the primary reason, or at least a primary reason in favor of degrowth, is an environmental reason. You also mentioned a rising standard of living. Is that a separate selling point of degrowth, or is that just a consequence of, well, if you sort of control global warming a little bit, obviously there'll be less suffering. And so if that's a separate point, can you explain how it is?
So basically, degrowth is a fundamental critique of the idea that in order to improve standards of living, in order to have a good life, we need economic growth. And it's rather saying we can also organize life differently without economic growth, while at the same time actually improving the living conditions, in particular of those who currently lack access to resources and to those means for actually fulfilling the fundamental human needs.
Okay, so this is at least surprising at first presentation of the idea, because we associate lower economic growth with suffering, right? You have when an economy stops growing, we call that a recession. People suffer during a recession. How could degrowth be good given those facts?
Exactly. This is probably one of the main. There's a couple of key confusions that are created by this term, and that often also lead to misunderstandings and to critiques, actually not the critiques that aren't really addressed to degrowth, but rather to the misunderstandings of this term. So to clear this out is important in the beginning, and one of the key misunderstandings is that degrowth is basically the same as recession. It's basically the reduction of the GDP, and that's the main thing. But in fact, we make a big effort of distinguishing degrowth from recession. So one of the core slogans of the actual French décroissance movement from the 2000s is your recession, so the capitalist recession, is not our degrowth. And why is this? Because degrowth fundamentally tries to address those dependencies, growth dependencies in our society that actually lead to these ripple effects that cause the reduction of the size of the economy to lead to a huge social crisis, and sometimes also to ecological crisis, to like a worsening of the fundamental situation. And we are living in societies where basically the reproduction of our lives depends on market activities, and thus on economic growth. But this does not have to be this way, and there's certain policies that are proposed in the degrowth frame to actually essentially decommodify the core of the economy, so that people can actually prosper without relying on these market forces, and prosper in situations without economic growth, because the entire economic system is a new economic system that doesn't need economic growth for stability.
Okay, that's really helpful. So let's get some more detail in front of us about degrowth. So you say in your book that degrowth actually requires some sectors of the economy to be scaled up, while of course naturally requires some sectors to be scaled down. Who should get to decide which sectors get put in which category?
In our current economic system, in the capitalist market economy, there's a tendency that actually those sectors with the greatest profits are those that expand the fastest. And from an environmental and social perspective, this is a very irrational, this leads to very irrational outcomes. And for these reasons, degrowth says we shouldn't rely on this natural process of market forces leading to creative destruction, but rather have a democratic debate where we rationally decide what things are actually necessary, what things are good, but also which sectors of the economy cannot in time be decarbonized, and thus should be not only transitioned to renewable fuels and full on cyclical resource use, etc., but maybe also to decline. Think, for example, of instead of using individual mobility and cars for everyone, think of public transportation and buses, which obviously reduces the amount of stuff we need, the amount of metals going into the transport sector for fulfilling maybe an even greater amount of needs. And for these decisions, degrowth actually proposes to have society-wide debates where it is centrally the workers who take decisions, but it's not just the workers by themselves, but there's also other stakeholders which are included in these debates. And this is more a challenge to these questions than rather than degrowth having the full-on answers. But I think essentially we also need to think about more global and transnational forms of making these decisions, because the repercussions of many of these decisions are essentially global as well. So I think some forms of global democracy very much come into the frame if we think about these questions.
That's really interesting. Let me try to get your thoughts on another challenge to the degrowth agenda. So with less paid work being done, how will people be able to afford the necessities of life like food, housing, and transportation?
Sure. So one of the core proposals, as I've mentioned a bit already, is to actually decommodify the supply of core goods and services that people need for a good life for all. So there's basically the proposal to have a universal basic income of some sorts that people have access to, or rather universal basic income, but also universal basic services. So this is the term we mostly work with. So people have access to housing, food, energy, a certain amount of energy, a certain amount of transport, local transport for free, communication, education, healthcare, etc., etc.
So this is interesting. It seems like degrowth sits at the center of a cluster of sort of very bold reimagining. So you've got new hedonism, you've got sort of new forms of democracy, you have universal basic services. So it all fits together is what you're saying. Okay, so that's really helpful.
Sure, maybe I can add a short thing on this.
Yeah, sure.
I think one of the things that make degrowth attractive to people is that it's actually trying to provide a very broad framework within which to try to articulate fundamental alternatives on a society-wide level, and trying to think about the relationship between alternatives in the spheres of consumption, production, of work, of environmental policies, social policies, etc., etc.
So there's an idea that there's a cluster of core social problems where you can't solve one of them without also solving the rest.
I mean, essentially, this cluster is created by the growth dependency of the capitalist economies. And then that's why also solutions need to be a bit more comprehensive and really work on this systemic level.
Okay. You say in your book that we should tax away wealth until there are no more wealthy people. What would you say to a critic who says that being wealthy isn't bad per se, it all depends on how you became wealthy?
I mean, sure, then one can have an argument about the legitimacy of this logic, etc., etc. But I think what we mainly want to make, the main claim we want to make is that the wealth inequality is so huge that there's basically no justifications that have a broad sway in society. There's a lot of studies showing this, and people trying to like really work on the ground on the perceptions of people's on the perception of how much inequality is acceptable. And for example, if people are asked what inequality, what wage difference between the lowest earning person and the highest earning person in a company or also in a society, what is acceptable? People come up with answers that are more or less not higher than 1 to 10. And this is a very small wage differential as compared to what we actually experience on a global scale. And so I think that the main claim is that we need to drastically reduce the high inequalities, and whether there might stay some small inequalities, I'm all for abolishing basically all of them, but because I think in the end, people should have access to what they actually need for a good life. And maybe there's a small bit above this that people can have differences in access depending on how much they contribute. But this is so difficult to measure, and giving the huge constraints, the huge ecological constraints and how they are linked because of the luxury consumption being much more resource and emissions intensive. I think given this, we should really aim at much more equality in our societies, and really put this at the forefront of also the environmental debates.
Okay. So another one of your bold proposals in your book is that we ought to shorten the working week. What's your argument for that?
Mm-hmm. So basically, degrowth, one of the core proposals is to radically reduce the working time. It's also called the enjoyable reduction of work. And obviously, this firstly aims at reducing the harmful work or the work that doesn't make sense. We're talking about bullshit jobs and bad shit jobs in this context. But then reducing the hours we work is also a goal in and of itself, because it liberates time. And André Gortz, one of the forethinkers of degrowth, actually talked about the radical reduction of working time being, or that one can understand this as a redistribution of the surplus value that results from the increases in productivity in our societies from capital to labor. And this also is one of the core reasons, if there is rising productivity in our societies, but we want to reduce the overall amount of stuff we produce, then in order to deal with the inequality, the unemployment problem, it does make sense to reduce the average working time, and to also, and that's the core of the degrowth perspectives, in addition to this, to share the necessary work equally, and in particular to share the necessary care work also equally in the whole society, also among the genders.
So this is another case where you have a single proposal that's actually motivated by not just one, but a cluster of moral concerns. You've got sort of core degrowth itself, but you also have a concern about sort of worker well-being and equality between capital and labor and gender equality. So it's motivated by all those factors.
Yeah. And very much, I mean, many people think degrowth is against fun. Degrowth is about living with less and this idea of sufficiency, sacrifice, etc. But I think in the end, degrowth is very much the opposite. And this idea of time prosperity and really looking at different modes of organizing life, not so much centering around wage work or work as in our societies, but much more about how we actually want to use the time this is a very fulfilling and attractive notion that degrowth tries to offer.
So it's not. So degrowth isn't just about what we ought not to be doing, but it's also about what aspirations we ought to have. Yeah. Another piece of the puzzle in your book is workplace democracy. What is workplace democracy, and why do you favor more of it?
So the core of the degrowth idea is to democratize the economy and to democratize everything that's related to economic relations. In our current economic model, democracy is very much restricted, not just in terms of how the process is organized, but also in terms of the area for which actually economic decisions, for which decisions are deemed to be democratic decisions. And so degrowth is for democratizing the entire economic relationships. And obviously at the workplace, the core economic relationships are happening. So this is one part of where degrowth is actually focusing on increasing the say of the people who do the work over what they produce, what they want to produce, how they organize their process, etc., etc. And this is going back to a long tradition of worker struggles for workplace democracy and seeing this as the nucleus for a broader societal democracy. But as I mentioned earlier, degrowth very much tries to balance this with the need to also include other stakeholders and people who are affected by these decisions in the process of also deciding what needs to be produced and how it's produced, because in the end, the whole society is affected by these decisions, and they are so central that it's not just up for the workers, but it should be a very broad form of democracy that includes workers' councils, but maybe also consumer councils, experts coming from various ways of life, but also taking into account core perspectives of the future use of resources and emissions, etc., etc.
Yeah, so you actually, now that you explain the rationale for workplace democracy, given that it's linked up with this broader sort of democracy agenda and this idea that we all have a stake in sort of the productive activities of society, what if somebody said, well, just because I happen to be the person doing the work, it doesn't necessarily mean that I deserve a special say. We all have a say in, how much coal gets mined or whatever. And so why not just skip over workplace democracy and just focus on sort of national or global democracy?
I mean, I think we should aim at a model where basically there's a certain framework that is decided at a very high level, where everyone has a say, and where it's very much similar to like society-wide forms of democracy, where everyone's voice is heard. But then within this framework, which should basically focus on ecological limits and the needs that should be met, and defining those. But within this framework, there's a lot of leeway, and I think it does make sense to have as much freedom as possible for people in their productive capacity, in their economic life as workers. So this leeway should not be kind of like reduced to a top-down decision where people are basically then forced to work in this context, but rather should enable as much bottom-up decision-making as possible within that framework to actually come to meaningful decisions. And if you look at some of the examples of economic democracy, workplace democracy, people actually come up with very interesting ideas of how to move out of destructive sectors and into ecologically very meaningful activities. So there is workers do want to produce meaningful things. So I think there's not necessarily a big contradiction.
Yeah, so that helps explain why there's still a place for workplace democracy, even in the context of a broader societal democracy, and what workplace democracy can contribute to the agenda of lower growth and greener way of life. So that's helpful. Thank you. So Let me talk about your book just for a second here. The subtitle of your book, the book being "The Future is Degrowth," the subtitle is "A Guide to a World Beyond Capitalism." How do you define capitalism, and what is the connection between achieving degrowth and moving beyond capitalism?
Yeah, so we wrote this book because we wanted to provide an explicitly a perspective on degrowth that is explicitly critical of capitalism, because we felt that this perspective is sometimes lacking in the degrowth debate and is actually necessary for this debate to move forward. And the reason is that we define capitalism basically as a global system that is based on class domination, private property, and competition, but it's fundamentally a system that needs economic growth, that needs expansion. And what that actually means is that there's an ever-increasing quantities of production under capitalism. The purpose of this ever-increasing amount of production is not to meet the human needs, but is rather to extract and accumulate surplus profit, surplus value. And to sustain this ever-rising amount of production and the surplus value, which is the goal of production. But above this, there's also at the systemic level growth dependencies that are linked to this need to increase production through competition in the capitalist market economy that eventually need to be curbed. So we need to curb this drive for expansion within capitalism in order to actually have a chance to achieving sustainability.
Well, Matthias, this has been incredibly interesting and illuminating. I want to thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, for having me.